Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Claire Kelly, and I'm from the Environmental League of Massachusetts. ELM is a 122-year-old environmental advocacy organization based on Beacon Hill. We've been advocating for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. And we have long been a convener on environmental issues, and we are proud to continue this long tradition in a new and digital way. Over the past month, headlines, research, and protests have brought to the forefront of the national dialogue the issues of pervasive and systematic racism and inequality. We grieve for the suffering and loss so many are experiencing across our country and in our own community. As an organization dedicated to protecting our environment and our public health, the ELM team has committed to educate ourselves and our supporters on the historic and current racism across Massachusetts, to understand cultures and practices that perpetuate systems of racism, and to advocate for policies that address these issues. People of color are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. Conversations about environmental issues are an essential part of the larger movement for racial justice, and today is no exception. Today, I am thrilled to hopefully welcome about over 200 of you who signed up, joining us live from across the Fourth Congressional District and probably beyond here on Zoom. I know many people are really excited about this race. We're also streaming this on Facebook Live for those of you joining us there. This is our final forum in a three-part series with the candidates that qualified for the ballot for the 4th Congressional seat. And I want to thank all of our co-sponsor organizations for your support in making this event happen. 350 Mass for a Better Future, Clean Water Action Massachusetts, Green Needham Collaborative, Green Newton, Livable Streets Alliance, Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, Massachusetts Sierra Club, Sunrise Movement Blue Hills, Sunrise Movement Boston, and Transportation for Massachusetts. These forums are organized to inform the public about the views of each of the candidates on a broad variety of intersectional environmental issues. Today, we will ask them to discuss how they would address the issues of clean energy and transportation, the connection between environmental health and public health, and environmental justice, including how communities most affected by racist structures and systems are among the most vulnerable to climate change. We've invited all of the candidates who will be on the ballot to participate. Sponsors of today's event are all nonprofit organizations presenting this forum to educate the public. We are not taking positions to support nor oppose any of the candidates. The views expressed by the candidates today do not necessarily reflect the sponsors' positions. So for the format today, each candidate will briefly introduce themselves. Then we'll have 3 questions that our co-sponsor organizations will ask each candidate. Then we're going to open it up for questions from you who are listening today. You can click below on the Q&A button to submit a question anytime throughout this webinar. We encourage you to include the name of your town if you'd like to let us know where you live in the district. You can also like or upvote the questions you would like to hear that others submit. Hopefully we can get to as many questions as we can. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but we can get started right now so that we have enough time to get to those questions. So today we are grateful to be joined by Newton City Councilor and Marine veteran Jake Auchincloss, former Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts and aide to President Obama and First Lady Obama, Dave Cavell, and epidemiologist, public servant, and mom, Natalia Linos. We're going to welcome each of you to give us a brief introduction of 1.5 minutes each. So we're going to go in alphabetical order to start. So Counselor, if you could start.
I appreciate you hosting this, and I appreciate everyone who's tuning in. My name is Jake Auchincloss. I am currently a city councilor in Newton. Before that, I was a Marine officer. If there is a silver lining to the public health crisis that is this pandemic, it is that hopefully it has raised awareness throughout the world by creating a fast forward version of what happens when large institutions fail to heed science and fail to coordinate. And that is what is happening with our climate change crisis on a slightly slower timeline. And we all need to recognize the lessons of the pandemic as they apply to our climate change challenge. My career has been about driving large institutions to act in coordination. In the world of business, at a Fortune 100 car insurance company, I was a senior manager in their innovation lab and helped convince senior executives that we had to plan for risk management products for a future of sustainable transportation. When I left, we were building insurance policies for commercial scooter companies, for example, because we recognized that we needed to plan for a carbon neutral future that was not reliant on single occupancy vehicles. In the City Council, as the chair of the Public Safety and Transportation Committee, I have been a 100% vote for Green Newton priorities, whether solar panels, plastic bags, or structural issues like mixed use housing and transportation policies that lower our carbon footprint by reducing parking and increasing the use of multimodal solutions. As a candidate for Congress, I have been the first to call for carbon pricing, the first to propose a policy paper on climate change, and a major advocate for offshore wind. Offshore wind will reduce the Commonwealth's carbon dioxide emissions by over 1.6 million metric tons annually, the equivalent of taking more than 300,000 cars off the road. It needs to be an absolute priority for the next member of Congress. And I will be a champion for offshore wind to ensure we get both the environmental and the economic benefits of this major clean energy solution.
Thank you. Councilor, if you could just wrap up the opening.
Absolutely. My final remark would be that I am on the virtual stage here with some very impressive candidates, and the ones who came before are also impressive. We're all going to say, I think, largely the quote unquote right things on the environment. The question that I think our viewers need to ask is, who has a track record of getting stuff done across different sectors, business, government, in moving large institutions to act at a time when there is tremendous inertia still about heeding science and coordinating to get to a carbon neutral future?
Thank you. And Dave Cavell.
Well, thanks, Claire. Thank you, ELM, for having me. Thank you all for tuning in. Look, our climate is already changing, and we are running out of time to take the steps that we need to take in response. And that's why I support a Green New Deal. It's one of the first things that I will vote for as your member of Congress. I support climate justice. I support urgent, bold action. And yeah, I think that that is one of the differences in this election. This work is not new for me. I was in the Obama White House, and I was there when we were implementing the Clean Power Plan and hammering out the Paris Climate Accords. I was in the Attorney General's office with Maura Healey when we were investigating and then suing ExxonMobil, the Trump EPA, stopping offshore oil drilling off the entire Atlantic coast. And the Fourth District doesn't just need somebody who's just going to vote the right way here. We really need somebody who's going to stand up and lead the right way. So I'll be rolling out the most ambitious climate plan in this race because that's what I saw as a public school teacher in the South Bronx. I saw the consequences of climate injustice. Half my fourth graders had asthma. And I saw the opportunities on the South Coast here in the Fourth District to lead the way. We have two choices: save the planet or don't. When President Kennedy said we would go to the moon by the end of the 1960s, no one thought it was possible, but we made it possible. That's the ambition that we need. I'm Dave Cavell, and I am ready for this fight because I've been in it for years.
Great, thank you, Dave. And Natalia, Linos.
Thank you so much, Claire, for having me. It's such an honor to be here. And yes, my name is Natalia Linos, and I'm an epidemiologist, a social epidemiologist who knows that health is not just the absence of disease. It's about where we live, our environment, the places where our kids go to school, our neighborhoods. So I joined this race late. I joined because of COVID, because I knew that the inequities that were playing out could potentially be devastating for so many generations. And I joined because, as a scientist, I know that there are too few scientists in Congress right now. There are actually only 11, and I hope to be the 12th. I'm also a mom, a Brookline resident, and I've been working on the intersection of climate change and health and environmental degradation, including biodiversity loss, at the United Nations for almost a decade. I led the portfolio of the UN Development Program at that intersection and worked with governments from across the world. I met with a minister of Fiji who was telling me about his worries, the Minister of Health, worries about the hospitals, just adaptation. You know, what would happen if there was a sea level rise and his hospitals will be inundated. I worked with the government of Zimbabwe to put solar panels on health clinics that were worried that the HIV, the medicines, were not being able to be kept at the temperature that they needed. And I've worked with communities and civil society groups here in the US, including Healthcare Without Harm, including the Climate Action Network, and many others, to bring about change at the local level, including when I worked with the New York City Health Department. I have decades of experience at the global, the national, and the local level. That's unique. I'm not a politician, I'm an outsider, but I've been in political spaces. I've been in conversations behind closed doors around what would happen if you, remove subsidies for fossil fuels. I've seen big industry try to block UN resolutions, and I've seen how you can get around it. And I've seen also youth from across the world, from across the US, especially underrepresented youth, speak out, and I will partner with them. I will be there to be the voice to move this forward, so thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. We appreciate you being here. Our first question is going to be from one of our co-sponsoring organizations, from Eva Castle-Collette with Sunrise Boston.
Hello, everyone. I thank you all for having me, and I would like to also appreciate all of our candidates' opening remarks. They were wonderful. My question for you all today is, how would you propose ensuring that all of the residents in our district have access to clean energy resources like offshore wind and solar? So I'm going to first pass it off to Councillor Jake Auchincloss.
I appreciate the question. It's a bigger question that can be answered in 1 minute, but it's the critical one. I'll say a couple of things right off the bat. First is carbon pricing. We need to price carbon in this country. There are 7 bills in the House of Representatives that would do that. They have different approaches. They have slightly different ladders. I would support the one that I think is the most likely to pass immediately, because it is the single most important substantive policy decision that we can make in Washington, D.C. to ensure that we get to a clean energy future. We have got to price carbon. However, there's a whole lot of other work to be done as well. Community shared solar, persisting tax credits for solar panels, making sure that we can permit offshore wind here in Massachusetts, which should be able to provide enough wind energy to generate electricity to power over 800,000 homes in Massachusetts, supporting net zero planning for communities, which is consonant with what Massachusetts has proposed to do to cut emissions by 80%. Municipal electricity aggregation at the local level, which we've done in Newton to get to 40% renewable content. And I want to give a shout out to Green Newton, which I'm sure is watching this call right now, which was a major proponent of that measure. And then finally, supporting frontline advocates and organizations like Sunrise Boston. I was out there on the Free the Tea charge 6 months ago with you all, because that's an important way that we can reduce our carbon footprint as a community. And a lot of times the best work happens at the grassroots level. And I'll close by just saying again, carbon pricing. We have to put a price on a metric ton of carbon. We've got to get that bill passed next term. It's going to be a key priority of mine, along with offshore wind.
Thank you. I will pass it off next to Dave Cavell.
Oh, thanks so much. Look, I think the short answer is we need to invest in these industries. We need to invest in infrastructure, and I think we need to elect other people who support these goals. We need to keep expanding access to offshore wind and solar by investing in them. When I was in the Attorney General's office, I helped put together a conference for the entire Eastern Seaboard Attorneys General offices on this topic. One thing that was clear was that we're perfectly positioned to lead. Fall River has the second deepest water port in New England. Brayton Point in Somerset is a perfect place to create clean energy jobs. And I also think that state leadership here really matters. And Claire, I know I don't have to tell you about the leadership from the Patrick administration, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Green Communities Act. And so, the last thing I want to point out here, it is hard for me because I really do like Jake, but this is a key difference in this race. I was really disappointed to learn that Jake worked for Governor Baker and voted to reelect him in 2018 over our ELM candidate, Jay Gonzalez. Governor Baker put fossil fuel executives at the DPU. The administration is investing in gas pipeline infrastructure. And, Governor raises a lot of money for Republican governors across the country who invest in anti-climate science. So I just think we need somebody who's ready to stand up and lead on these issues. That's exactly what I want to do, whether it's the Green New Deal or so many other measures in this race.
I appreciate your comments, and I'll pass it off to Natalia Linos.
Thanks so much, Eva, and it's nice to see you again. So in terms of the clean energy question, at the UN, we always talk about it as a triple win. It's clearly a win for the climate, and we are in a climate emergency. We need to talk about it as that. It's a win for public health. As someone who has worked extensively on air pollution and air quality and how that impacts every part of our systems, it's not just childhood asthma, it's cardiovascular disease, it's COVID. It's critical. It's also critical for jobs. And I think that's where Massachusetts Fourth has so much to gain. And I would work so closely with the leaders in Fall River, in Somerset, in Taunton, in order to make sure that these jobs are here, and we're investing in offshore wind. But let me tell you at the federal level what I would be doing. At the federal level, it would be extending the incentives. These are tax incentives. I think what people need is to know that there will be predictable money coming. You know, incentives that go for 1 or 2 years and are coming to an end, that doesn't create the predictability that we need to really invest in clean energy. I would be working on legislation to allow for permitting, as Dave mentioned, and I would really be working to ensure that these jobs, that we are ready for them. This means a just transition, so people who have worked in other types of industries have these jobs, but also new people. You know, women are underrepresented in engineering and these sectors, and people of color are too. So making sure that these jobs are actually available to everyone, and making sure that the leadership, that the communities themselves, that civil society groups are part of the conversation. But clean energy is a triple win, and we need to get everyone behind it, not just the environmental groups. I've been working with the health groups, and they're a pretty cool ally for you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Eva, for joining us. We really appreciate you being with us today. Our next question is going to come from Mark Diane with 350 Mass Action. Mark?
Thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming. Vehicles produce about 40%, a little more than 40% of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in Massachusetts. Will you push for a rapid transition of the public vehicular fleet and the mass transit to non-polluting technologies, electric or hydrogen or other, by 2035 or sooner, as well as using government contracts to require vendors to do the same? This is kind of a critical point. It's not a market solution, but it's a big part of what we need to do. I'd like to ask Councilor Auchincloss first.
Well, not only will I push for the rapid transition, I already have pushed for it. About a year ago, I stood at the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board and advocated for option 6 of the Commuter Rail Vision Study, which calls for all electric regional rail. I made that a cornerstone of the comprehensive transportation plan that I put forward right after announcing my candidacy for Congress, which calls for 15-minute headways in all electric regional rail, connected bus rapid transit with all electric buses, better infrastructure for cycling and walking, and of course, carbon pricing. Turning our underinvested, underperforming transportation infrastructure in this Commonwealth into a mass transit system that we can be proud of, that rivals some of the global leaders like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, would be an initiative that would not only get us to a carbon neutral future, and as you say, Mark, it's 40% of our carbon emissions comes from the transportation sector. It would also take us a giant step forward in not just economic growth, which is critical at a time when we've got 20% unemployment in Massachusetts and 25% in the South Coast, but also in economic equity. What we tell people right now in this Commonwealth through our transportation system is that if you're living in a lower income or a historically Black or brown community, then your time and your public health doesn't matter as much because you're sitting on a bus 2 hours in either direction. We need to fix that. That is an environmental issue and it's an economic justice issue.
Dave Cavell?
Well, yeah, I'm thrilled that you brought this up because you're absolutely right. I mean, there is no way to confront the climate crisis without confronting transportation. So look, I was the first candidate in this race to endorse a presidential candidate, and I endorsed Elizabeth Warren. And I'm glad that you said 2035 or sooner, because she was talking about 2030. And that's where I think we need to go. You know, we need to set our ambition high and follow that lead. So, you know, her plan relied on clean cars for clunkers, trade-ins, and we're looking at the shipping industry and a whole bunch of other things. And, you know, to make this point here, I want to say I worked on this in the Attorney General's office. And you might remember that back in the day, Volkswagen's diesel cars seemed, their pollution emissions seemed too good to be true because they were lying to the world. A.G. Healy got about $35 million in return for Massachusetts. And we proposed funding electric vehicle infrastructure and other measures here in the state with that money. That's exactly the blueprint that I think we need to follow. Zero emission vehicles are already cheaper to drive than cars that run on gasoline in most cases. And that's what makes it all the more tragic that the Trump administration is tearing up emission standards, which we sued in the Attorney General's office. But who wants to buy a car that gets 10 miles to the gallon these days? Nobody. So this is where we need to go. This is what we need to be working on. And, I'm thrilled that whether it's walkable streets or high-speed rail or anything else, this is what I would like to work on with the Biden administration and with all of you on this call.
Thank you very much for the answer. Natalia?
Thanks so much, Mark. And coming third, it's hard to disagree. I agree with a lot that has been said by Jake and Dave. I think the additional pieces is that, I come from a car-free household, even though I have 3 little kids, and for moms, you can imagine not having a car, it's hard, but it's a privilege. And it's because I live in Brookline. I have access to buses. I have access to the green, the T. It's important to recognize that public transportation is a privilege that many millennials, many young people, many parents would prefer to have it. And so I will invest in public transportation equally to investing in electrification of vehicles. But I don't think anybody wants to be stuck in traffic. I don't think anybody wants to have 2-hour commutes to Boston. So the South Coast Rail is critical. It's also important to put in some buses. And I really care about inequities in terms of economic justice. So I would push for free buses for low-income families, low-income workers, electric buses, of course. And I have seen so many countries across the world revolutionize their transportation system in months, in years, and much poorer countries than the US. So it can be done. That's the first message. The second message is that I've seen the data within New York City, because at the health department, looking at what it does, traffic, what it does for the neighborhoods, for the households near that traffic, and the impact. And it's, maps where red and green, and that maps exactly on top of racial and other economic injustices. And having looked at that data for New York City, and having seen New York City take very progressive action, I think that Massachusetts can and must do better. But my bottom line is I shouldn't be alone in having that privilege of being a car-free household when many others would like that too.
Thanks very much to everybody. Thanks for having me on.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you for joining us today, and thanks to 350. Our next question from our co-sponsor organization is actually from ELM with Malia Khan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and thank you to all the candidates for showing up and being here. So the question that I wanted to ask the candidates today is, communities of color and low-income communities suffer disproportionate impacts of pollution and environmental injustice that are often concentrated in their neighborhoods. What policies would you fight for in Congress to address these pervasive and systemic inequities and ensure people of color have healthy, walkable neighborhoods, clean air and water, reliable transportation, and safe housing? And can we start with Dave?
Well, sure. Look, I think I'm thrilled that you asked this and recognize exactly as you say that these issues are intersectional. There is no justice without climate justice. And we don't just have a climate crisis, but a whole range of crises, exactly as you point out. So I do think that the short answer is Green New Deal. And I think that, look, I've seen environmental justice, as I said, with my own eyes in this country, from redlining to placing highways and factories in these communities. It feels like we're polluting communities of color and low-income communities by design. And look at how climate injustice played out in Chelsea. The COVID crisis hit a city hardest that has a highway above it and an airport next to it and some of the highest rates of air pollution, lack of safe housing, transportation. Same in the South Bronx. When I was a teacher, as I said, half my students had asthma, and climbing 5 flights of stairs every morning to my classroom left them exhausted. They're 10 years old. So, I think that's why we need to include these communities and amplify these voices and make sure that they are at the table and making these plans with us. I need to pass the Green New Deal and make these investments. And then we need to ask the wealthiest Americans and corporations to pay a little bit more so that we can invest in public transportation and free buses and all the rest of the solutions that we know that we need. So look, I think the Green New Deal and these issues are intersectional because that's the truth. That is the reality in this country. And we need to recognize it and recognize the communities that are crying out for justice and for a green future that is rooted in justice for everyone.
Great, thank you. And then next, can we have Natalia?
Thank you so much, Malika. It's so nice to get that question because, to be honest, I'm a convert to the environmental movement because I started off in the social justice movement. I've done a lot of work on income inequality, on racism and health. I was writing a lot on racial segregation. And then the environmental movement came on, coming up more and more environmental justice issues. And that's how I moved into that sector. And I feel that that has to fundamentally be always part of the conversation. Indigenous rights, rights of communities of color, as well as a just transition for those low-income workers or workers who are losing their jobs. So I think justice is what has brought me to the plate here and what I will be fighting for. So specifically what I'll do, I mean, there are the direct ways that we've already been talking about, but there's also indirect ways. For example, I'm really interested in the case for reparations, right? The case for reparations is being set out around through the historic legacy of racism, but the case for reparations from a health perspective also includes the fact that we have deep-rooted inequities. Could the case for reparations bring apart the environmental injustice so that the communities that have buildings and that have environmental challenges because of the highways and things like that, could we get money to those people? Can we get indirect ways, transparency, for example? At the UN, I was talking to some parliamentarians and they said, if you forced governments to report who they were meeting with, we would know that they had a meeting with Exxon. And, so basically transparency around lobbying and lobbyists, those are other indirect ways because lobbies are not there to serve the poorest or communities of color. And, the direct ways would be data. I'm a scientist, so I would look at the data, look specifically which parts of our district are most impacted, and resources would go there. And as Dave said, COVID-19 is both a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity. There will be so much investment. And as a public health expert, I will be saying, we can't say one or the other. We have to align the COVID response to a Green New Deal. Resources that are need to be going, to create new jobs because we've lost so many jobs, need to be green jobs. We need to have targeted support for the communities that have lost the most, suffered the most, and who need the most from us. So I am really excited to be part of this conversation, and environmental justice will always be my guiding direction.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Councillor Auchincloss.
Our transportation infrastructure in this state tells low-income communities and communities of color that their time and health are less important than others. And in the medium term, we need to reinvent transportation in this Commonwealth. We need a new Eisenhower plan, not for highways, but for mass transit. And we need to do that through a Green New Deal that brings sustained federal funding, partly financed by, here it is again, carbon pricing, so that we can ensure we have the infrastructure both for transportation and for energy that will get us to a carbon neutral and more just future. But in the short term, we have a fire right now in this Commonwealth. In Taunton, for example, the City Hall just had to issue 160 pink slips to teachers. They had to cut $6 million. I'm on the Newton City Council right now. I can see 2 fiscal years ahead myself. We are in for a hard couple of fiscal years as a Commonwealth. We need immediate federal relief for state and local budgets because they can't deficit spend. And if they do not get relief from the federal government, we're going to see cuts to education and cuts to essential services that are going to hurt low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately. We need federal relief for education, public safety, waste management. We need to make sure that low-income communities and communities of color are taken care of during this hard stretch that's going to be coming.
Great, thank you all for your amazing answers. And thank you for being here.
Great, thank you, Malia. All right, now we are going to bring it to the audience questions. So we're going to try and make the answers a little bit shorter, maybe a minute, so we can get to as many as we can. But you guys have been great so far and trying to keep under the minutes. So I appreciate it. I haven't had to cut anyone off too much. So from one of our listeners today, would like to know, out of the original presidential candidates in this election cycle, which I know feels like a long time ago, but whose climate plan did you like the best and why? And we're gonna start with Natalia. Do you wanna answer that?
On climate change, I think, Inslee's plan was the most comprehensive, was the strongest, and the one that I supported. I actually happened to be in Seattle when he was signing some of the bills. He has been a leader. Now, I'm not saying that he's the one I would have voted for overall, but on the climate, yeah, it would be him.
Great. And Counselor?
Jay Inslee, yeah, he really nailed it. And a lot of the candidates put forward really thoughtful plans. I thought Senator Warren's as well was significant. And I also appreciated the fact that we talked about a Blue New Deal as well as part of those plans, because it's really critical to recognize that more than 70% of this earth is not dry land, and that the health of our oceans is not sort of figuratively or metaphorically tied to our own health. It is literally directly tied to the health of our communities as well as our economic futures. And I think that needs to be an increasing part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo. Governor Inslee's plan was great, and it's why the candidate that I did endorse, Elizabeth Warren, adopted it entirely, because I thought on issues of real consequence for the district, on tough issues, on close questions, I wanted to be honest with people about where I stood. So that's why I was the first candidate to come out and say I endorsed Elizabeth Warren because of the Blue New Deal, because of her adoption of Governor Inslee's plan, and because of her real urgency on these issues. And I think, it's a real model and a real example for us to understand that, if we think that this is a crisis, we need to act like it, and when we say that Black Lives Matter, we have to act like that as well by recognizing the intersectionality of climate injustice and responding to it with the urgency that this moment demands. So I'm glad that somebody asked this, and I really want to thank everybody on this call for treating this issue with the seriousness that it demands.
Great, thank you. We appreciate all those answers. So our next question is around kind of what's been happening lately. Natalia, I know you mentioned that the pandemic has brought you into this race and encouraged you to run. So we'd love for you to expand on why that is, and for the other candidates, over the last few months, and the impact, how is the impact of the pandemic change your thinking and priorities around energy and environmental issues? So I know we kind of screwed up the order a little bit, but Natalia, why don't you, do you want to expand upon that a little bit more, and then we can have the other two talk about how their thinking has changed in the past few months.
Sure, and yes, I joined the race in late April, and I will not be able to claim any first on this race with 9 of us running since I joined that late. But the reason I joined the race is because as an epidemiologist, I had started warning about the fact that we have such deep inequalities in our country and such a disdain and sort of hesitancy around science, and climate is one of the issues that, where we've seen that I was worried that it was going to lead to the worst pandemic among wealthy countries. And I wrote a paper in the Washington Post on March 2nd when we had the first death. And then it started happening. I started working with the Poor People's Campaign, looking at low-income workers and their risk and how the government kept failing to provide PPE, not only to hospitals, but to the essential workers that were doing work on the streets. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs around the fact that we were using police to sort of to punish people for not being able to socially isolate, when in fact we had not made the means available to them. And on the environmental front, I heard over and over that had to wait, that basically our priority, we are in a global public health crisis, not in an environmental crisis. But in fact, the two are so connected that you cannot have a public health expert not stand up and say, climate change cannot wait. So I decided to enter this race because I thought we needed more scientists. We needed more people who could look at data, who had a commitment over decades to fighting inequality, to be part of the conversation. And COVID is not going to go away. Unfortunately, we are trying to pretend that it is, and we're starting to loosen and go out. But for the next 18 to 24 months, COVID will be front and center. And this Congress has to have more people with an epi background to be part of the solution. And if you can find an epidemiologist like me, who is also an ally on every single environmental justice issue and climate change, all the better, because I will link the two agendas, the COVID-19 response with the response and advancing the Green New Deal. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. It's certainly interesting to hear from an epidemiologist right now. Great. Well, Counselor, what about you?
When I first launched this campaign last fall, we had roughly 2% unemployment in Massachusetts, and we did not have a public health crisis that had killed more people than Vietnam. So absolutely, my thinking and my priorities have had to update. I think it would be irresponsible not to have done that over the last 6 months, given the twin crises that we have seen unfold under an administration that is going to be remembered in history, not just for its malice and its disregard for our norms and traditions, but also for its sheer incompetence, its true unbelievable inability to do even basic things correctly, much less sophisticated things like would be required under a public health crisis. So although the core priorities of getting to carbon neutrality as a country and ensuring a more economically equitable growth for Massachusetts have not changed, we do have a fire in the house that we've got to put out. So with unemployment now spiking past 20% and with municipal budgets throughout the state cratering, my number one goal in the short term in Congress is we've got to get federal relief for state and local budgets so that they can prevent cuts to essential services. We also have to ensure that we are working with state and local officials, including, yes, Governor Charlie Baker, who has handled COVID competently and well, to ensure that we have the testing and contact tracing regime in place that's going to ensure that we can open up schools, daycares, in a responsible way so that our economy can reopen while maintaining public health.
Great, thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, well, really, I think it hasn't changed my urgency on this so much as underscored it. And look, yes, we are living through a tragedy, and my heart goes out to any of you watching who've been impacted by this horrible crisis. But this is why I got in the race. I mean, I worked on these issues. I had stood up to the Trump administration, and I knew that we were in real danger as a country and as a planet because of it. I worked with the pandemic response team in the White House, in the Obama White House. They warned about exactly this moment that we are living in. That's why I thought that we needed to restore professionalism and integrity and experience to government and to this work. And so, look, I think there's a whole bunch of short-term things that we need to do immediately in this country, from supporting local city and town budgets in the midst of this crisis, particularly on the South Coast and elsewhere. But long-term, this just underscores the urgency of investing in real action on the climate crisis, the urgency of all of these issues. They're not going anywhere. And they really, in a lot of ways, are our best response. There are 50,000 total coal jobs left in the whole country, total. There are 110,000 clean energy jobs in Massachusetts alone. So I think as we emerge from this crisis, that's the place to start.
Great, thank you all. I know everyone is, as you mentioned, underscored and sort of been thinking about how all of this impacts everything. So I know you've all touched upon this a little bit, but we have one of our listeners, Katie Milway, asks, how would you connect what we need to do for climate to what we need to do for racial equity? And we're going to go back and start with Councillor Auchincloss.
I've said before that the single most important thing we can do for climate, I believe, is carbon pricing, because it sets both the right incentives for the market, but it also creates a significant funding stream for the federal government to then invest in infrastructure. I continue to believe that carbon pricing is the key. And like I said, I will be a champion for it in Congress. We can use the funds from pricing carbon appropriately to do two things that I think are important for both economic and racial equity. First, we can directly transfer funds to American families, to those who are hard hit. And there's a lot of people who are hard hit right now through the rebate program. I think that's an important way to sustain both people's standards of living and also to sustain broad-based political support for what originally is going to be a challenging policy item to pass. And secondly, we can use the funds from carbon pricing to invest in infrastructure that allows for more economically equitable growth. And I've talked already about how our transportation system needs to be reinvented to ensure that everybody has access to the mobility options that allow them to have a safe, reliable, and convenient commute both to work and also for areas of recreation. So we got to price carbon, and then we've got to use those funds both to rebate to families and to invest in infrastructure that undergirds equitable economic growth.
Great, thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, so look, as I mentioned before, I think that this is exactly the right question to be asking, because, if we say that Black Lives Matter, we need to recognize that they do, including in climate injustice. And I think that there's a few things in response, everything from really investing in public transportation, mass transit, free pilot programs for buses, green retrofits, healthy public housing. But I also think that this is history that we need to teach as well. The history of climate injustice is something we need to be aware of. The intentional decisions to put polluting sources in communities of color. This is something that we need to grapple with. And as a former school teacher, I think we need to teach so that we can grapple with this as a country. And then again, as I said, I think we need to bring everybody to the table here. We cannot be developing policy without everyone at the table and everyone's voices in every conversation. And so, you know, that whether that means community benefit agreements that are agreed to before any developers want to start building something in a community or in any other way, we need to make sure that everyone benefits from the Green New Deal. Everyone is at the table and everyone is building a green future together.
Great, thank you. And Natalia.
Thanks, Claire. I mean, I've spoken a little bit already to this. I think the areas that I could talk a little bit more about are housing, the fact that, you know, there is this, you know, we could do a lot better to improve the housing conditions of Black and other people of color, while also doing the retrofitting, the green, and ensuring that money is improving the quality of housing for poor families, as well as moving us forward. So I think housing would be good, very important. The other one is really thinking about adaptation, really thinking about which communities are at greatest risk, which communities are at greatest risk directly in terms of, you know, sea level, or if there's a catastrophe. You know, at the New York City Health Department, we were thinking about things like which individuals do not have access to air conditioning during a heat wave, because that kills. And really thinking about racial justice along all those dimensions, so transportation, housing, neighborhoods, even nutrition. You know, climate change is going to impact how nutritious our food is, and we already have an obesity epidemic and undernutrition in some communities more than others. So really thinking about it holistically, taking individuals as not one day just experiencing climate change, which is global, but making it local, but then going back to the global level. You know, we're not going to solve the climate crisis without a global solution, showing leadership. And I think the movement for racial justice is also one that is a global movement for social justice, and thinking about the most vulnerable countries across the world and the most vulnerable people within them. So I have experience at all those levels, at the global, the national, and the local, and I hope to bring that to bear in any decisions that I bring forward in Congress. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We appreciate that. So our next question, we've actually, I think, asked in our previous forums, and some of you have even touched upon it, but some have said that the Fourth Congressional District could have more to gain from offshore wind development than almost any other congressional district in America. If elected, can you briefly share your top priorities for harnessing the potential power of this resource? And we're going to start with Dave on this one.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, I think, first of all, that's correct. That's exactly right. And so this day-long conference that I put together in the Attorney General's office, we put together a panel just about this, about Atlantic offshore wind. And I think what's really important to note here is that sometimes we're told that the fishing community is opposed to this. The truth is they see the collapse of fish stocks in their water because of climate crisis. They are ready for real solutions here. We just have to bring people to the table and make it happen. I think the federal government's delaying of the Vineyard Wind project was a real mistake. And I think that this is where we need to lead. Fall River, as I said, is the second deepest water port in New England. Brayton Point in Somerset is a perfect place to build wind turbines and offshore wind turbines. This is where we can put people to work, create a pathway with tuition-free public higher education at a place like Bristol Community College, right into good green union jobs on the South Coast. And I think that this is just something that we need to absolutely invest in and champion and lead on. This is what we do in the 4th District. From Barney Frank to even Father Drinan, we stand up and we lead. We don't just vote the right way. So that's what we need to do on this issue too.
Great, thank you. And Natalia?
I fully agree with Dave. Offshore wind is a huge opportunity for District 4. It's a huge opportunity to produce locally our electricity and to create jobs in Fall River, in Somerset, in Taunton, create jobs to build all the different parts, to also run the different parts. It's really, really an obvious sort of thing that we should be running towards. And it is something that I will support. I will work with local leaders to get the permits and, to move this forward quickly. And I do want to touch on the biodiversity consideration. And I have been speaking to some environmental groups to make sure that what are the real concerns. And they've highlighted the Atlantic right whale and sort of the measures that can be taken to ensure that we do not endanger that species and ensure, that during sometimes, we can turn off the windmills and ensure their passageway. So there seems to be a conversation around responsible, offshore wind, and everybody agrees that it can be done that way. So I am a huge proponent. I'm a huge proponent for the jobs, for the clean energy, and for the economic benefit that it will have to part of District 4 that has really not had the same shared prosperity as other parts of this district.
Great, thank you. And Councillor.
I don't think any candidate running for Congress in the Massachusetts 4th is going to say anything but very good things about offshore wind, because it's an absolute environmental and economic win for the district. The question is, which of these candidates has done the work to actually be effective on day one? In addition to talking to state and local officials who are involved in this process, I've also had a conference call with senior leadership at Vineyard Wind to understand from their perspective, the ones who are actually trying to develop this project, what do they need to be successful? What they need to be successful is permitting to be unlocked from the Department of the Interior. And I will pledge right now, the Department of the Interior is going to be so sick of hearing from Congressman Jake Auchincloss about this issue all day, every day. They have something that comes up for funding. I'm going to be right there to get this across the finish line, because just saying you're in favor of offshore wind is one thing, but actually understanding how large institutions work and how you can get something from the 10-yard line to the end zone is what actually makes a member of Congress effective. And that's my commitment right here. I will say one other thing there. We can also make Massachusetts the leader in clean energy technology through the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. That's going to require federal and state partnership, and that is also a place where a member of Congress can be critically important in tying together federal funding with state, local officials, and with the scientific community to create not just an economic engine, but an innovation center here in Massachusetts for offshore wind and for clean energy technology. We can do what we did with life sciences in Massachusetts for the clean energy industry.
Great, thank you. And our next question, another listener would like to know, what would you prioritize in a green recovery? And we're going to go back and start with Councillor. You're going to go first.
When you go from 2% unemployment to 20 or even 25% unemployment in the space of 2 months, it can feel like an explosion has gone off in the economy. And I think at the very short term, what we need to ensure is that people can meet their basic essential needs, that kids are able to get a quality education, that people are able to meet their prescription drug, grocery, rent needs. And for that reason, I would have supported the CARES Act were I in Congress when it was proposed. And I will continue to support whatever relief is necessary to make sure that we are not sending people into poverty because of a pandemic. However, there needs to be a plan for a path forward, and the status quo is not good enough. We need to ensure that the jobs that we create to get out of this depression are jobs that guarantee a living wage and a dignified retirement. And I'm proud to say that I'm the first candidate in this race to get a union endorsement, and I've continued to get endorsements from organizations like IBEW 223 in Taunton and Ironworkers 7, because they know I'm going to be a champion for good paying jobs under safe conditions that make sure that everybody recovers together.
Great, thank you. And Dave.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of answers to this question. I do think that this is where the federal experience that I'm the only one in the race that has will really matter, because it's true. We've got to work with the people who are on the front lines of this. You know, I think State Rep Pat Haddad was actually really right when she said that, you know, she's been a huge advocate for offshore wind, and we need federal tax credits here. We need to incentivize this. When Lars Peterson, the head of Vineyard Wind, was on that offshore wind panel, he was talking about this too. We need real champions on these issues, and that's what I want to be. So look, I think that there's a number of answers to this question. I do think that investing in green new jobs is exactly what we need to do at a time where there are so many Americans who are out of work. And I think so many of the other intersectional issues from the Green New Deal play into this as well. You know, we need to invest in tuition-free higher education and cancel student debt. We need to help, you know, renters and mortgagers who did not really get assistance from the Federal Relief Acts in the first few rounds of coronavirus funding. You know, we need to make it possible for people to get through this pandemic and then make the investments we need to make in our future coming out of it. And that's what I'm going to be an advocate for.
Great, thank you. And Natalia?
Hey, Claire. So it's a hard question speaking to an epidemiologist, because recovery to me is always around, the public health. When are we ready? When do we reopen? How do we reopen? And what I've been saying when speaking to the community that wants a green recovery is that that's what I want too. And what's important is staging it. It's ensuring that we are thinking about, for example, the federal government is going to have to ingest so much money to get people back working and to sort of kickstart our economy again. Ensuring that that money is actually targeted to green jobs. Ensuring that, proposals, or where we've sort of stopped around public transportation, where we've had a hard time because of the big budget dollar amount, including the South Coast Rail, like this is our opportunity. We need more jobs. Let's make sure that those jobs are aligned with these initiatives that we've been pushing for a really long time. And then I do want to take it back to what Jake said, that, our local government will need support from the federal government. And that has to be also tied to the green recovery, because if we don't see eye to eye on this issue, and if we don't ensure that the COVID response is part of our plan and part of the path and takes us in a different direction, we will fail. We can get off track really easily. So I'm entering this race as an epidemiologist who wants to ensure that the COVID response, which will be led by a lot of public health folks, and the advice and the guidelines, that doesn't take us in a direction that will be difficult afterwards to steer back onto sort of a green recovery. So it has to happen from day one. And I'll be the candidate who has the background, who has the knowledge, who has the data and the science. And also, I can admit to the things that I don't know. So I'll bring in the right people to advise on what are the specific strategies. And, I do want to say that I am an outsider to politics in many ways, but I have a real desire to listen, to build, and I lead with my values. And equity is the value, a green future is the value. As a mom of 3 little kids, that's really important to me. But I will listen and plan and use data and science to guide us. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to try and squeeze one more question, and if we can just be really short on the answer. But we had someone ask, Massachusetts has 1,500 miles of coastline and is laced with rivers and streams. If elected, what are your top priorities for protecting the Commonwealth from sea level rise and increased precipitation? And Natalia, we're going to go back and start with you.
Yeah, and in my earlier answer around racial justice, I talked about adaptation. Adaptation is key given our geography. I haven't mentioned yet on this call, but I'm a first-generation American who grew up in Greece, also very coastal, also very concerned about the islands. And I know firsthand that, island states, small island developing states across the world are worried that their entire existence is under threat. So adaptation has to be taken into account in Massachusetts because we are coastal. And that means, investing in, if we have to relocate communities, ensuring that we're doing that through a equity lens, ensuring that they have support, ensuring that we're not displacing without providing the means to do so. It includes, as a healthcare professional, looking at our hospitals. I was in New York City, during Sandy, when NYU's hospitals were destroyed because they had the generators in the basement, thinking through how do we build resilience for our institutions that are essential during a crisis. And then just, data, who is most likely to be impacted? How do we solve this? And then putting the resources where they're most needed.
Thank you. And Dave.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's also important to remember that our waters are a way of life for a lot of people on the South Coast and elsewhere. We've got 83,000 jobs here in Massachusetts that are supported by this, and we need to address emissions, we need to address overfishing, we need to address pollution, and we need to protect this incredible, pristine beauty that we have in Massachusetts. And Elizabeth Warren's Blue New Deal helps us do that. We have to stop emitting, and the ocean absorbs about 93% of the heat trapped by global warming. Talk to the fishing industry, again, they agree. We have overfished and wiped out close to 90% of the big fish in the ocean since 1950. And as your member of Congress, that's why I'm going to fight for the restoration of a lot of those protections. I stood up in the Attorney General's office when we were suing to protect the Endangered Species Act, which the Trump administration, like a cartoon villain, was trying to destroy. I've talked to some of the leaders of these countries when I was at the White House that we're literally going to be underwater, that we're buying land in other countries because they're going to be flooded. So I think it's really important to protect, to recognize that, water pollution isn't just about oil spills and sewage dumping, but it's about agriculture and construction and everything else that the Blue New Deal recognizes. So that's a beginning of an answer.
Thank you. And Counselor.
I thought Ms. Linos' answer actually was fantastic. Just because we're running in a campaign together doesn't mean we can't agree sometimes. I would just build on that, on her points on proactive protection and conservation planning and resilience by just talking about clean water and the Clean Water Act more broadly, and that ties into our streams and our riverways. I think this will surprise 0 people on this webinar, but President Trump has been an absolute disaster for clean water legislation in this country. Started the repeal of the Clean Water Rule in 2019. We got dirty water rule, toxic water rule, sewage bending rule. There's loopholes in our Clean Water Act now. This administration, to an unprecedented degree, has been hostile to the very idea that our waterways are public commons that need to be protected for the benefit of all. It's actually truly scary. And unfortunately, given how many other depredations are on his track record, the press doesn't cover it enough. So I would support the Clean Water for All Act in Congress, which would block some of these disastrous executive actions and would work to maintain the protections that we have in place right now. And we really need to build on the Clean Water Act to ensure that all communities have access to potable, safe drinking water.
Thank you. Right under time. Great. So I think that wraps up all the questions. We've got a few minutes left, so I just want to give each of you the opportunity to kind of give a closing statement. And why don't we start with, I think we were on Counselor. Go back in order.
We've talked about a huge amount of stuff right now this last hour. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for organizing this. Just to reiterate key points about what my priorities are. Carbon pricing. I said it like 7 times. I'm going to say it again. We have got to price carbon in this country. It is a critical way that we will get to a carbon neutral future and that we will curb the worst effects of climate change, while also giving us the funding that we need to both invest in families and invest in the infrastructure that gives us a clean start for transportation and energy production. We need state and local relief. We got to prevent cuts to essential services like education, waste management, fire, that are coming down the pike if we're not careful as a country in places like Taunton and Attleboro and Fall River and Needham and Newton and Brookline. Throughout the Massachusetts Fourth, we need help. And then a green economic recovery. We've got more than 20% unemployment in the Commonwealth right now. It's not good enough to go back to 2% if we're just creating the same old jobs that we had before that are not part of a green future. We've got to ensure that people have a living wage, a dignified retirement, and that we are on a carbon neutral footprint. I have a track record in business, in the military, in local government of leading in crisis, of leading in uncertainty, and of leading in collaboration. And that is what we need in Congress in 2021, because while we can't be sure what current events will be unfolding at that time, what we can be sure of is that we need people who are anchored to core values, who have clear priorities, and who have a track record of getting results.
Great, thank you. And Dave. Wow.
Well, thanks again, Claire. Thanks again to ELM for hosting not just this, but the whole incredible series. And again, I hope everybody watching is safe and healthy. And I want to thank fellow candidates as well for sharing your good ideas on this critical issue. Look, this is not the moment for incrementalism. This is a moment for leadership. This is a moment for people to recognize that we are running out of time to save this planet and need to reinvent our economy if we want to do that. So I think we really need somebody that doesn't just want to have this job, but wants to do this job, wants to lead on this work. And that's why I'm in this race. You know, this is the work that I've done in the State House, in the White House, in the Attorney General's office. On every single one of these issues that we talked about today, this is the work of my career. And if you believe in the urgency of this crisis, if you believe that we need to pass the Green New Deal, if you believe that we need to lead the way here in Massachusetts and in the 4th Congressional District on these issues and be the national leader in saving this planet, I think this campaign's for you. So my website is davecavell.com. It's the only website in this race that I believe is fully translated into Spanish and Portuguese as well. We are serious about reaching out to every single person in this district, including you. So please come to the website, sign up, believe that we can do this together and save this planet and the future of this economy here in Massachusetts. Thanks so much and be well.
Thank you. And Natalia.
Thanks so much, Claire, for having me. It's been a really great conversation. So as I said at the beginning, I'm an epidemiologist with a global background. but we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and climate change is also pretty much a global pandemic. And someone with experience working in the international arena with governments from across the world is someone you want. Someone who is a scientist, who understands data, is somebody you want. And this may be one zoonotic disease pandemic, but we know that this isn't the first one or the last one. We're going to have a lot more of these crises coming, and we're going to have a lot more climate induced crises coming. So you need someone with my background to be in Congress. Unfortunately, given this administration, I hope they will not be the next administration, scientists are sidelined. If they don't agree with them, fire Fauci or get out of the WHO. That is unacceptable. If you can fire a scientist, then let's elect some scientists so that they cannot disregard that expertise. We need people with my background in Congress, and I hope that everybody in District 4 will understand that I will serve every single one of you. Inequities has been the driving force of my career, and if you want to learn more about my platform, just check out my website, nataliaforcongress.com, Natalia for congress.com. And if you want to volunteer, we have a lot of energy, and I did want to give a shout out to the youth movement. On climate, you have been up front ahead of all of us. So I would love for you to be part of my movement too. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I want to thank each of you for joining us today, Councillor Jake Auchincloss, Natalia, Linos, and Dave Cavell. We really appreciate you joining us. We really appreciate all the co-sponsor organizations again, and for all the viewers for joining us. We will be sending out recordings for all of these, the forums we've held over the past week. And most importantly, we really encourage everyone to get out and vote on September 1st. Mark it on your calendar. It's going to come up quicker than we all realize. So we hope you stay engaged in your community, keep advocating and fighting for policies that fight the climate crisis. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.